Well, number 13 in our list of unhealthy theological beliefs or philosophies of life is the things called relativism. And you hear people say oftentimes colloquially, "Oh, well, it's all relative." Well, the truth of the matter is in life, not everything is relative. I mean, there are a lot of things that are very connected and very important and make a difference. And there is some things that are right and wrong. I mean, basically, if a airplane tries to land in a place other than where it's really prepared for that plane to land, it's not going to be relative. It's going to be very exact. The idea of relativism is that truth is in itself something that's very subjective. In other words, it varies from person to person. You have your truth, I have my truth. And, there's only a limited way in which that actually makes sense. I mean, you may have your view of what's true, and it may be different from my view what's true, but in reality, only one of us can be correct. Now, we both can be wrong, but we can't both be correct if we believe two different things are true. That if I believe that up is down and you believe that down is up, one of us is going to find out that the gravity is going to define exactly what's true. And so I think that gravity is not a relative thing. It's something that is across the board. Now, I've had people say to me, well, gravity is relative. You can get in a plane and you can defy gravity. And I would agree, but you're not really defying gravity. What you're doing is you're manipulating dynamics in order to enable you to resist the pressure of gravity. But sooner or later, gravity is going to force you back to Earth. Even things that we send into outer space may circle there forever, and we call them space junk. And one of the dangerous things about space junk is eventually it finds its way by gravitational pull back into our atmosphere. And if it doesn't burn up, it's going to crash and put a big dent on the planet and maybe in your head. So we have to understand that this idea of relativism is really more something that we use to excuse ourselves. And in fact, it's not a new theory at all. In fact, the earliest evidence of it that we have was a Greek philosopher by the name of Heraclitus in the 6th century BC, 600 years before Christ. He drew this startling conclusion. He realized, he said, if drinking seawater is poisonous for people, and yet fish can live in seawater, then the world must be relative. There is no absolute truth that exists. And that's what's so funny when you come to that conclusion, because obviously fish and humans are very, very different creatures. That I can live in water, but I can't breathe water. And a fish basically has the mechanism that can draw oxygen out of the water and keep himself alive. But the point is, you take the fish out of water and he dies, and you put me underwater and I'm going to die. Those are kind of absolute realities. They're not relevant realities, nor are they necessary contradiction. But yet we find that this whole idea is really the basis of most of scientific theology today. And I say theology because it's not something that's proven out by any kind of scientific determination. What I'm talking about is evolutionary theory. Evolutionary theory holds that the universe is here by accident, that everything that exists just kind of happened all into itself. Now, that violates one of the basic laws of science. We know that there's no such thing as spontaneous generation, which means that something came out of nothing. If there is something, we can trace it back to a original something. And this is the problem that evolutionary theory has. They can't explain the origins of the universe. They can't understand the origins of life. So that, when they say that everything came from the Big Bang, well, you have an explosion. There has to be some combustibles, first of all. And secondly, there has to be a fuse and somebody who lit it. So there has to be a reason for everything that starts. And so it basically presupposes that there is a creator, and yet evolution tries to essentially say that the universe created itself out of nothing. Now, you can argue all day long. You can never demonstrate that nothing creates something, no matter how many times you say it and how many ways you say it. Everything that is comes from something, and then you add to it the incredible complexity of the world. Again, you're faced with the fact that this requires too much planning and organization. In the summertime, I love sitting out on my back deck and watching the birds come in to eat at my bird feeders. And what's amazing to me is you watch birds of different kinds flying and their acrobatics, if you will, in the sky. You know, there's no airplane that we've ever built that could do what a simple little sparrow can do in your backyard. It can take off and land, it can accelerate, it can stop, it can change directions. I mean, it's amazing what it does. And yet we sit there and then sit back and say, well, it just evolved that way. Well, the thing would have to survive long enough to evolve that way. And that's the problem, is that as those supposedly genetic changes are taking place, usually mutations, if almost always, lead to the death of someone, shorten the lifespan rather than extend it and give it a greater quality. So there's so many problems in it, but it's so hardwired into the culture because people like Darwin and those who came after him definitely wanted to be able to explain life without having to give a nod to God. And they just want to deny that God was there. And whether you take the book of Genesis literally, which I think that you really need to if you're going to have sound theology, but unless you take it literally, you have no other real explanation for how we got here, because obviously God created. There had to be a greater power out there that caused all this to be. And again, some people say, well, what about the UFOs? They put us here and so forth. But then it begs the question, if there are UFOs, where did they come from? They didn't just pop out of nowhere. Who made them? Who created them? And it basically, so what they do is they just add millions and billions of years, and the idea is they extend it out far enough, then suddenly they don't have to answer the question anymore. It reminds me of a story I heard, I was told it was a true story, of a science teacher in a Christian high school. And he asked his students a question. He said, if my car broke down and I got out and opened the hood, and then I pulled the largest wrench I had out of my trunk, I stepped back a few paces and threw that wrench at the engine, would that repair the engine? And every student said, absolutely not. That wouldn't make any difference. He said, what if I threw that wrench at that engine 1,000 times? Would that fix the engine? And they said, no, that wouldn't change anything. Then he asked the question, what if I threw that wrench at that engine 4 billion times? And almost all of the students in class said, well, in that case, yeah, you probably fix the engine. But the thing is, nothing's changed. And there's the underlying problem. When we look at the universe, it came from something and exists in incredible complexity. It didn't pop on the scene. It had to come from somewhere, from something of incredible power and design, incredible power and intelligence that exceeds anything that we can replicate on the planet. And then you want to turn around and say, even though that would be required for life to exist, we don't believe that God had anything to do with it, or there is a God. And that becomes really the ultimate condemnation in Romans 1, where it says, because they didn't want to retain the knowledge of God, God gave them over to their imaginations. And so relativism is one of these really kind of stupid imaginary ideas, the idea that basically we just kind of happen to be here. Nobody knows where we came from. Nobody knows where we're going. And the Bible very clearly declares, this is where we came from and this is where we're going. And you need to live in that rubric. You need to live in that reality that we came from God and we are ultimately going to have to confront God at the end of our earthly journey as not just ourselves, but the entirety of humanity. And that's why the Bible says we need to humble ourselves in the sight of God and recognize that the Lord of the universe also is the controller of the universe, who is holding the universe together. They call it the God particle. You know, that God is holding all of this together. They call it atomic glue. And so whenever you talk with the evolutionists and they begin to throw all sorts of ideas and kind of speak to you like you're a Neanderthal who's still dragging your knuckles across the floor, just ask them a very simple question. Can you explain to me the origins of the universe? And what they'll be saying things like, well, they started with, there was light. Well, where did light come from? Well, there was this murky thing. And just keep on asking, but where did that come from? Where did that come from? And eventually they'll either admit that they can't explain that, or they'll get it and walk away from you and mutter something about your stupidity, because they can't. Because there has to be a originator. There has to be, therefore, a creator. It has to come from someplace. And because it's come from someplace, it's also headed someplace. And this is why I think that Genesis 1 and 2 are so critical, because it's written not as a fable, not like some of these ancient, like Gilgamesh epics and things like that. It's not written like some kind of creation fable. It's written as a narrative, a story. It says God did this in 6 days. And I've had people say, well, that's impossible. God couldn't create the earth in 6 days. My response is, if God is God, and he's all powerful, and he's all knowing, why couldn't he? Why does he need more time? What does that require? Why can't he do that? And, again, they just simply say, well, that's not I can't accept that. Well, you may not accept that, but that's a very reasonable argument. What a lot of times they say, well, that's all relative. You have your faith, I have my faith. And that's somewhat true. You do have your faith, but is your faith grounded in reality, or is it grounded in fantasy? Because really what you talk about evolution, what it really has brought us to is a thing called social Darwinism. And social Darwinism was basically, I think one poet put it very simply, I think it was T.S. Eliot, who said that nature is red with blood and claw. That it's this idea that really is moving the discussion when you talk about globalism. Globalism is really predicated in the idea that there are an elite group of people who have wealth and power, and they are more evolved than the rest of us, and they should rule, and they need to reduce a lot of us so that they can ensure that they're able to continue controlling life from here forward. And that's really a lot of the thinking behind much of globalism. Guys like Klaus Schwab and George Soros and all these guys, they consider themselves to be more highly evolved than the rest of us. And the fact of the matter is, they're not. And they'll figure that out one of these days as they stand naked before the God of the universe. But anyway, so much for things that we need to oppose. Relativism is the biggest theological threat to the church today. Got one more. Finishes up tomorrow. God bless you.